South Asia. Okay. And the comparison was fairly close. I didn't put in the slide because otherwise would be death with PowerPoint. So it's like Europe had 20 plus languages, so does India. There were so many states in Europe, so many states have been divided based on linguistic classification in India. But why is Europe a continent and India is a subcontinent? One reason, because Europeans drew the maps. So that was the slide, so just to digress, so, and then there is a comparison between India and China. And the reason why China is so homogeneous, because that's a lot of it is Han, while India is very diverse, type of thing. And in the history of India class, I did that, like I did not know that in the town where I grew up called Surat, where the East India Company got their foothold in 1601. I mean, there were Armenians and Jews and Arabs and Turks, this was in 1600s. It was like a big cosmopolitan. There was globalization before there was globalization. So that's just by way of introduction. And the reason I got into this is after doing the class on East India Company and history of India, I ran into an Englishman who spends half his time between Delhi and London. And he had written a book about the big first corporate raiders, which was the East India Company. And he had written another book called Return of the King, which was about the British efforts to restore their puppet regime in Asia. And that got me interested into the Great Game. Because before that, like a lot of us, I had just barely, they knew, there was a war in Afghanistan, but that was it. So that's how the whole impetus got started. Now, the Great Game was between the Russian, the Tsarist Empire, and the Empire of Britain, which was the crown jewel, India. So that's where they were worried about the borders, rightly or wrongly. And the Russians, and interestingly through YouTube, I found there's actually a Russian video from a Russian point of view, from an Englishman who is a Russia expert. So, and their worldview was totally different, and their word for the Great Game was called Tournament of Shadows. So that is the Russian expression for it. I mean, that's the trivia that one learns, type of thing. Okay. Now, and before there was Kim Kardashian, this was the Kim that was most popular, the movie and the book by Rudyard Kipling. And this was his famous quote that the two Brits, would remember this. And obviously those who are literature fans would recognize the Kipling statement, So that's how they got into. Now, this is the formal outline for the class, Afghanistan from Alexander to forming of country. That is part 1, British-Afghan Wars 1, 2, and 3, Afghanistan in 20th century, and the last is cover on. So this is a lot of material, and for somehow, I think I had this should have been a 4-session class, but ideally, and now, last night I put in this link, that if anybody gets busy and cannot attend, the PBS, I think after the Afghan withdrawal, they had done a nice timeline of for last 100 years of Afghanistan. So this link all these links are clickable, usually this thing, but I'm not going to open it because if you're interested, it's just like the whole summary for last 100 years. So it was real timeline. So if you get busy and if you want to just browse through that, it should take you about 5-10 minutes to look through that, but it was a succinct and very nicely done summary. Okay, and now I made a mistake as usual. I forgot to start recording. So let's see if I can do this without making a fool of myself.
I already did it. It's already recording.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, thank you. That was very nice of you. I had a notes to myself, but I got a bit carried away. Thank you for doing it. So as from the other classes, we'll send out the slides and the recording of Zoom. Now the Zoom recording will not stay live for too long. So I think if you wanted to save it or share it, do it sooner rather than later. Okay, so this is the thing. So, and I think at least, and we have a co-host. So if I cannot see the chat, type of thing, please just and just jump in if you have a question or comment, because this is it's meant to be an interactive class. So this just gives you a brief outline type of thing. Okay. Okay. Now this is, I couldn't resist this cartoon, type thing. Okay. Okay. Like, I mean, I hope you can read it. I'm not going to try to magnify it, Identify Afghanistan on the map to gauge your personal and patriotic engagement with your country's last 20-year war. And probably Afghanistan is not that difficult to locate on the map, unlike Iran and Iraq, because I was always chuckling as to how many regular citizens would be able to spot the difference between Iran and Iraq, type of thing. So this was, one of the things. So where is Afghanistan? It's there somewhere, because if you had a Eurocentric education, probably your history or geography lesson ended somewhere at Israel or the Middle East, and that was considered. So that was, and it's somewhere over there. That was about it, And now this is just I mean, I'll have be inundated with maps, but just ignore it, type of thing, But this gives you an idea about the color-coded map, which gives you a nice idea that it's the country that is one of the a few landlocked countries, and that it became a curse, as you can see from the geography, that the Russians always had the eye for the warm water seaport, so so that was the big bone of contention, and they were at the crossroads. And now I'll have another map showing the ethnic composition of Afghanistan, and they are called Pashtuns, P-A-S-T-U-N-S, while in India we use the same word as Pathans, P-A-T-H-A-N. So I hadn't heard the word Pashtun until the war started. And this is interesting that Pashtuns can best be described as Scots without alcohol or enlightenment. And I thought that was a nice tongue in cheek, you can realize it's okay. Now they're fiercely independent minded, and got college sword fighters. And if it wasn't for the Scots, maybe the Britain would not have been able to acquire the empire, because they were really, and obviously the Scottish Enlightenment, you're all very well aware, type of thing. So, and the other area is called the NWFP, which is the abbreviation that was in vogue in the British India, was called Northwest Frontier Province, and it's still Pakistani still had used that as area. So, and in the showing that is just like in India, there are varieties of ethnic composition, like the North Indians and South Indians, type of thing. There are various ethnicity in Afghanistan, like even in China, they have the Xinjiang, the Muslims type of thing, and Han Chinese and the other Chinese. Similarly, in Afghanistan, there's various ethnicities. So one can clearly say that every Pakhtun is an Afghan, but not every Afghan is a Pakhtun, which just explains it, more or less. And now, again, just to show that I do have some listing in literature, this was the famous poem. This is the entire poem, but just the last few words about Rudyard Kipling's famous poem to the young British soldier. This was written during the Third British-Afghan War. That's when Kipling, who was barely 15, 16-year-old, was made a reporter stationed in Northwest India, and obviously was a talented man. And his father was an architect of, I think, to the best of my recollection. And this is his poem, which you can all read, type of thing. It's like, when you're wounded and left on Afghanistan's plain, women come out to cut up your remains. Just roll up your rifle and blow out your brains, and go to your God like a soldier, repeated times 3, soldier of the Queen. So this is the entire poem. Is the link is apparent. And this is somehow, I have weird synapses. And this was a cartoon that was, I don't know, when I was in high school or something, I ran into this thing. Do you like Kipling? I don't know what, naughty boy, I've never been Kipling. And I still haven't been able to find what exactly Kipling means. So if anybody knows what Kipling means, let me know. Okay, I think it's in an urban dictionary of some sort, type of thing, but the name is, the real meaning escapes me, type of thing. So now, so this is, now this is one picture that if you've gone to school in British India or in the UK or in for other British colony of dominance type of thing. This is one picture that exemplifies the whole of this thing, and you can, and we'll show this many times. I mean, this is the classic painting. If you have to see one picture, this is the painting of the remnants of the army. Okay, this was done much later, but this was represents the real defeat of the mighty British Indian Army. That was in 1842, and the painting is obviously 30 years later, showed up as Dr. William Bryden on the famous retreat from Jalalabad. Went to Jalalabad from Kabul, which was about, in kilometers wise, 120 kilometers. And well, just about everybody was massacred. And he was the only white man who returned, And subsequently, there were a few Indian soldiers who made back to the camp. But that was much later, and their names were lost to posterity. So this was the famous painting. And not to be outdone, during the recent war after 9/11, Britain had a substantial portion of army, and one English soldier wrote with apologies to Kipling. So it's a whole poem, you can read it at your convenience, but the last paragraph is, or stanza is worth reading. Just like your forebears in mud, dust, and ditch, you will march up and you'll fight, you will drink and you'll bitch, whether froggy, or Zulu, or Jerry, or Boer, the Brits will fight on till the battle is over. You may treat him like the dirt, but naught will unnerve him. I wonder sometimes if the country deserves him. So it was a nicely written poem. So obviously, it's a man with many talents. So he complains about some of the abbreviations may be unfamiliar to the Americans, but MOD is Ministry of Defense. I think if so I think that's the only abbreviation there in the whole poem. And all things, I came across it from the Daily Mail. Okay, so there is good stuff in the Daily Mail also from time to time. Okay, now just to keep the interest, that this was the thing, that this was Afghanistan has been known for this particular gem, and this goes back to it's 7,000 before current era, I think. So this just almost for me, because this is the particular gem that was only available and has been founded Indus Valley civilization that was discovered when the British Empire was trying to build railroad across the Northwest Frontier province, and that was the whole civilization. And unfortunately, the script has not been deciphered. So the precious stone has been, and that's been mined in what later became Afghanistan. That thing, and it was in Rome and Egypt and all over. It was exported, long before there was Islam in the modern Middle East. Okay. And so this is, okay, this was a big gem stone type thing. And you can see that and there are varieties of, there's a whole Wikipedia page for it. Okay, all right. Now, I think at the Rich Kennedy Social, which some of you do attend, this was, he brought up, and so it prompted me to look it up, that these are the Afghanistan's untapped natural resources. Let's see if I can, I think, so these are varieties of this thing. So starting from industrial minerals and to gold and copper and mercury, tungsten, and not to be done. There was also lithium that can be mined. So that was a big. So they have a lot of untapped resources. And again, there's a whole page that the Arab news channel Al Jazeera had a whole page on it. There's some of the mines that are near the Bamiyan province have, almost like a 1.7 billion tons of ore, iron ore, as well as gold deposits. So it's a big, so they have a lot of natural resources that have, so, and also not only that, also there is marble. So, and so that's why, and there was, and if you recall your history, even during the Clinton era, even the Taliban, came to negotiate to Houston to negotiate for oil pipelines running through that, but never materialized, type thing. So, Okay, and again, this is, as I said, this is the so-called ethnic map of Afghanistan. Let's see if one can zoom it without messing it up. Type it up. I think it doesn't work very well at my end. Okay, but you can see that there are varieties of ethnicity, and it's nicely color-coded of Pakistan as well as Afghanistan. And one can see that the uh, color, the Pashtuns extend on both sides, and that has been a big bone of contention that has gone on. And that was the crux of the issue as to when the borderline was drawn after the Third Afghan War. Nobody took the ethnic composition into it, and Mr. Durand just drew an arbitrary line, relatively, So that has continued. The struggle continued for uh, until even into the present time. So the Pashtuns crossed the border merely, and I'll show you later on in the last session that Pakistan is building not just US is building wall against Mexico, but similarly Pakistan is finally trying to put a barbed wire fence across the whole border extending from the uh, Arabian Sea all the way up to divide to keep the Pashtuns. And the border crossings have been strictly manned. So they are trying to do separate the border on both sides. Okay, and there are other ethnicities. Type thing. There is something called the Baluchis, and on the north there are the Tajiks, okay, and the Hazaras. And so that's and not just that, not the ethnic thing, but even among Islam, just like there is in Christianity, there is the big divide between Protestants and Catholics. That way, in Islam, there are two big divides: the Sunnis and the Shias. And the Shias are the ones that are predominant in Iran, and also to some extent in Lebanon, in Syria. And Sunnis are the predominant ones in the rest of the world, and primarily big sponsors being Saudi Arabia. And that's, so that's this division goes back to, I don't know, almost shortly after their prophet Muhammad, as to who was the heir apparent. So this has been going on. So, and as you can see from the city, in the green in the center, where my arrow is Islamabad, the modern capital of Pakistan, and right on the border is Peshawar. Okay, and this was Peshawar. That was and this was the border thing during the British India, and that was part of the big British cantonment. And at the same time, it goes back even further, that they had the gardens and schools built on Mughal pattern, and still many of the Khans or Maliks, which were the landowners, gentry, and they still follow the code of Pashtuns, and which I'll have a lot more to say about it afterwards. Okay, interestingly, the two things that Afghans primarily believe in, one is Islam, of course, that you are all very well aware, and the second is that the code of Pashtuns. Okay, so those are the two things, and the tribal warfare that has been the big dividing factor that has ruled their lives. Okay, and the things that they would be charged with is protecting the Persian word. The Pashtun words are Zan, Zar, and Samin. Zan means women, Zar means gold, and Zamin means land. So those are the three codes. And just like the, Hetfields and McCoy, or the mafia, the wars between the Italian families, the wars, the tribal warfares continue, first within the tribe and with other tribes and with outsiders. So there are varieties of, tribal warfares have gone on, and that's what the code that the men tend to live by. And this is ethnic studies by Dr. Vicky. Okay, and this is, having grown up in India, the classical Hindu verbal text, which was written down later, are called the Vedas. And there are 4 Vedas, that are carried out by oral tradition. The oldest of them is called Rig Veda. Okay, and even in Rig Veda, like you can see, together came the Paktas, and so that refers to the ethnic minority in the northwest frontier. Okay, and this again, so this goes back to they were believed to have been written or composed rather. It's not written because they didn't believe in writing down anything around 1500 BC before current era, and the varieties of tribes that are described with the yet to came the Arya's comrade through love and spoils of the heroes to lead them. So that was one of the hymns of the Rig Veda. And much later came Herodotus, the well-known historian. He mentions the tribes. Obviously the Greeks pronounce it differently, okay, in the Herodotus history. And then later on, another 400 years, the famous historian Strabo mentions about the Pakhtuns and the Persiani in that area. And this map that you may be able to see is that this is, I have a detailed map afterwards. This is the part of the Persian Empire. So this was one of the satrapies of the Persian Empire. So you can see that the border of that extended into up to the Indus. This is the Indus River right here. I hope my arrow shows up now. Let me see if I can try to be clever and show this with the laser pointer. Okay, somewhere around here, this is the Indus River, as you can see here. And this is, so it's a part of the Persian Empire, before Iran became Islamic. Okay, so this goes back to Cyrus and Darius, okay, empire. Okay, and just to give you a more detailed view, this was the extent of one of the largest empire of Cyrus the Great, which dates back to 550 before current era, and it extended the greatest extent in the reign of Xerxes. And so he went all the way up to Greece, as obviously with the classical education, you probably know more about it than I ever shall. And so they extended into the Balkans, Eastern Europe, Indus Valley. And so it was a big land that they covered. And so, and you can see from the lower right-hand corner, that's where the modern day Afghanistan comes up, type of thing. So this is, part of the Persian Gulf. So that just gives you a proper perspective as to how far that extended. Okay, all right. And now these are some of the Bactrian Greek. This is the 4th century current era. The heads have been discovered, and this is near the present day Jalalabad. Okay, that's one of the cities. I'll give out several names for it. So now, because I have so many maps, so I didn't send out the glossary because that's kind of becomes redundant. So I think you can see it on the map. Those are easily findable. So those are not like scientific terminology, which maybe. Okay, and these are some of the Bactrian documents which are in the Greek script from 4th century current era that mentions the underlying word. If you know your Greek alphabet, it mentions Afghan. Okay, the chief of Afghans. That's the translation. So that's what. So this is just the history. So this is the first word earliest mentioned in writing of the word Afghans came about. Not to be outdone as to the connection between South Asia extends until the present day. This is okay. I'm sorry. This is one of the actresses, modern. I don't have her name. Because I don't follow too much Bollywood, type of thing. So, and she's of Pathan ancestry. She grew up in Bombay, and she is an actress in a lot of the Hindi movies of Bollywood. Not to be outdone, the person on the right is the current Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan. And his character, he's actually a former cricket player, okay? And cricket, obviously, a lot of you know, at least the game that is most confusing. And someday I think, Mike and I will do a class on explaining cricket, so, okay, all right, the intricacies. So he was a playboy cricketer and married a rich heiress in UK, and now they are divorced, and then later on decided to go into politics, and he's of Pathan ancestry, so that's how his name is Imran Khan. Okay, so the links of the South Asia continue from India on the left, Pakistan on the right, and obviously Afghanistan is our thing. So Okay. All right. So this is, so it's an interesting this thing. So, okay. And not to be outdone. So this is the so-called code of the Pashtuns. So you can see that. Let's see if I can uh, point my laser pointer. Okay, the code that read is called Pakhtunwali. That's the way of the Pathans. Okay, the tribal tradition. And the words are harder to pronounce perhaps, but the first word is hospitality. Okay, protection of every guest, and that probably was what was used by the Mullah Omar of for not giving up Osama bin Laden. And that he said, okay, this is the code of the Pashtuns. So that was probably his excuse or some type of personal explanation as to how they could not give up, because that was a big demand after 9/11. And the word Nanavati was also a refuge type thing. So, and interestingly, the Nanavati as to how the language travels, I have a good friend who grew up in the south in near Bombay, and his last name is Nanavati. So, and he's, this, if one has to dwell into the caste, he's a Brahmin by caste. As to how, and now he was almost floored when I said, "Do you know what your name means?" Okay, and actually, Nanavati in his this thing is to, in at least our understanding, well, until I came across this, was people who are money lenders. So those were, money lenders. His family must have been money lenders. So that's how the name, but how that came about from Pashtun, the word, the language tells us. And there are some other words, which are Badal means revenge. So, and we very well know how the revenge business comes about, how the tribal warfare, and the same revenge continued in modern Iraq. In Iraq, there was a cartoon during the Iraq War. So why do you want to kill these people? Yeah, he killed my uncle 800 years ago. So that's the part of the revenge tradition that has been continued. Okay, and I think there's an Italian word for it also. And this is and actually, I think I would have been, if it wasn't for Malala, I wouldn't have been able to find any women who I could have mentioned. So thank goodness she stood for her rights to go to school, because to be popular in Oli, I have to include more women in the class. So I'm doing my best to find as many women as possible. So this is her famous quotes, type of thing. So this is what you can read it yourself. I'm not going to read it and, take time. So I think because we have a lot of material to cover. So, okay. And this is an interesting thing is right now, at the same time for revenge wise, I found it, there was during in Afghanistan, during the First World War, the first Brit-Afghan war, that the Afghans had a saying, in Pashto, you should always kill an Englishman first, because the first one came for hunting, the second one comes to draw a map, and then the army comes and take over your country. So it's better to kill the first one. So that was their philosophy about the Brits type of thing, and and perhaps but it didn't work out too well for the Brits, as we shall see, during the second next class. Okay, and these are the origins. Now, this was interesting that during the Orientalist age, when the Oriental scholars in Calcutta in 1790 discovered the linguistic links between the Indo-Indian languages, i.e. Sanskrit, and Bengali and Hindi. And Hindi was not even around that time, but between Sanskrit and English. Actually, some of you may know there was a polymath scholar named Oriental Jones, who was not only knew all the classical languages as well as a lot of European, Western European languages, but also was fluent in Turkish and Persian. And he was appointed the judge of Supreme Court in Calcutta in 1790. And he was trying to work with the natives. And at that time, Persian was the lingua franca of the Mughal Empire. And so that's when he discovered the language, the linguistic origin between Sanskrit and Greek. And that's when they finally, and that kind of rightly or wrongly, they gave them the justifications. Okay, well, these are the long lost Aryan brothers, and it's our mission to civilize them. So that was one of the reasons why Orient, and obviously at that time there was hardly any genetics or and even the racial classification came in a little later between the three main races. As to the white race, the word they used was Mongolian, African, and so there were the Amerindian, the four races that came in later on. But they were trying to identify, obviously, they were all biblical scholars, so they were trying to identify the relationship with the tribes of Israel, because everything went back to Bible in those days. But again, that's been disproven by a wide margin. But these were some of the thoughts as to the origins, as to of the Afghans. The second thoughts was they were descendants from the white Huns, and there may be some truth to that, perhaps, And then there was the other thoughts where they were descendants of the Shakas, which were the nomadic people from Eurasians, and again, and the descent of Paktas, the Sanskrit, which I already alluded to earlier. Okay, so but that is, but the modern genetics has changed dramatically, and so the structured analysis have shown that there are actually a mosaic of components representing various geographic regions of Eurasian ancestry. Okay, now this is, and hopefully, I think I have, this is a nice little map. I don't think there is any sound with it, but it would be interesting to see. It's a nice map that some clever chap has put together. Indo-Greek kingdoms. We'll talk about all of these in details. Scythians that we talked about, Indo-Greek kingdoms, '69 current era, these are the Huns. Okay, then they jumped 700 years. You may be familiar with the city called Ghazni. Extended all the way to Afghanistan. The Marathas were the Hindu kingdom. Oh, this is the start of the Afghanistan. By that time, East India Company controlled Bengal. Okay, I think so that gives you a big this thing. So I think you can play with the map later on if you so choose. Okay, and now this is just to show that this is the somewhat rather complex diagram, which people with the medical background may be more interested than regular. So this is various genetic background that is done as to the admixture of took place between the gene flow that took place. And there's a lot of work that is being done based on chromosome mapping and something that is called haplogroup. This was, if you recall, if you read the National Geographic, this was the way to classify population migration before the modern day genomic sequencing. And you can see how there was not that much gene flow that occurred from east, and that most of the thing was the same clients that continued to travel through the Central Asia, European, and the Caucasus, as to how the population migration took place into the peninsula, and the admixture with the native Indus Valley population took place. So this is the subcontinent gene flow. And some of you took the classes that I did on aging and human evolution. I concluded just last week, and we talked about, and there's a well-known Harvard geneticist named Robert Reich. He had written a very nice book about the peopling of the European subcontinent as well as the Indian subcontinent. So he talks about how the migration took place, and before the word Arya got maligned, that was the big flow that took place from Central Asia, and now the word has been replaced with something called the Yamanya population, and that was the migration that took place from the steppes of Central Asia into Europe, and it replaced the farmer gene population in Europe. There was two flows of migration that took place into Europe as well as in South Asia. And even just this morning, I was reading some article about one of the English islands, Orkney, that the population genetic mixture is different as from the farming population of Mesopotamia. Because originally it was thought that the peopling took place primarily from Mesopotamia and the farmers, that thing, but they were dramatically replaced by the flow that took place from the steppe region. Okay, so that's, and this again gives you a more interesting view of, okay, let's see about the genetic flow that took place. As you can see how these are the so-called haplogroups that are done. Okay, and that's classified based on the large group of population based on given in lettering called R or M. And you can see from the density that the R group is more in Europe, as well as had migrated out from Central Asia into Europe, as well as in South Asia type of thing. So, and if you have interest in doing your 23andMe, it will show your particular haplogroup as to how it migrates, type of thing. So as to how, and the predominant group that was in Afghanistan is called R haplogroup, and there are varieties of subgroups that are classified as to RM 198, and even this thing. So even I was one of the early adopters of 23andMe, and I had done my haplogroups, it goes down to somewhere in this region in North India, and there was probably some admixture that took place. So the same haplogroup that is found in this region is the same as for mine, type of thing. Just a slight variation of one letter as to similar to what takes place in sickle cell. So that's so there is so much similarities that takes place. So this is and again, this rather complicated slide that we talked about earlier. And historically, this is an interesting timeline from WashU, okay, along the Silk Road. The Silk Road has been around for those of you from ancient times to the great Marco Polo's venture, and this goes on to the trading continued from Roman Empire, Byzantine Empire, and before that even Macedonians, the Seleucid Turks, the Sasanian Empire, the Parthians, the Islamic dynasties, and we'll go through some of these, and then on the Eastern Front, a lot of the Chinese dynasties, and last but not the least, the Mughals, to be followed by the British Empire. So this gives you a nice timeline type of thing. So this is in interesting link for, let's see, I'm not going to jinx myself because once I open the link, then it's harder to get back into the slide. The PowerPoint does not like it when you mess with it too much. So, but so if you have time and interest, please feel free to look over that, So these are all, that's why I put in some of the links, type of thing. Okay, I'll take a breather and see if any questions or comments type of thing. So this is an interesting timeline that, one can follow about the whole region. All right, if not, and that's we talked about some of the basic, this is perhaps a bit of a repetition, but this was the Indus Valley civilization that I alluded to earlier. That dates back to now some of the more recent excavation. The timeline has been pushed back further from 2500 before current era to as far back as 1300 BCE. And the Indus Valley originally was just thought to be confined to modern day Pakistan, places called Harappa, okay, and Mohenjo-daro, which is the Mount of the Dead. That was the name that was given in the 1930s when the British archaeologists discovered that. But lately, the work has been carried out in the whole of Indus Valley, including present-day Rajasthan and Gujarat, all the way to the Arabian Sea. So it extended to a huge vast area. Why they disappeared, that is because there is no signs of any battle or between the so-called Aryan expansion that took place, or actually the ideal word I should use is Yamanya expansion that took place around 1500 BC current era, and followed by the religion that obviously quite a few of may be familiar with, the Zoroastrianism, which was the original religion of Afghanistan, of Iran, sorry, I misspoke, and before the rise of Islam and the Islamic conquest. And the Zoroastrians migrated to India around 1200 current era. And the small but very influential community still is the big financial who is who of India right now. And some of you may be familiar with the so-called Tata family, which are big conglomerate in India. And they were the first to westernize, and they're the first industrialized, and the biggest charities that are done are by the Zoroastrian community. And they were also, not to be outdone, they were not all nice guys. They were also involved in opium smuggling, as we talked about in the class on opium, history of opium that we did a few months ago. Okay, so this was some of the history, and obviously the first encounter with Europe was during Alexander's great march to conquer the world took place. So we'll talk more about it now. Now this is the military map, which was which is just to, let's see if I can zoom in on it a bit. Let's get the pointer if I can. Okay, and this just shows the various provinces, as to put it in a modern perspective, as to Kandahar, which is a much more conservative area, and the north, Mazar-e-Sharif, which was the point of entry, and the Bagram Air Force Base is fairly close to it. So I'll have more slides on it, and the Herat, which is on the Iranian border side, and there's the various road. And you can see that the topography is rather difficult because it's a hugely mountainous region, and on the northern, on the northeast corner, these are the famous Hindu Kush mountains, and then the desert, and there are the few plains in between. So it's easy to invade, I know, from different directions, but it's hard to keep it in control, and that's what various regimes have found out from time and time again. Okay, so, and this is, I'll have some more to say about the so-called Wakhan corridor, which is this little tongue that sticks out, and it was done for a purpose when the Brits drew the boundary line. So it's an interesting history that we shall go into a little later. Okay, and these are just one of the slides that as to how different regions have contributed to conquering modern day Afghanistan. Okay, starting from the Alexander the Great. Now Parthians, this I still have some trouble with. I don't think the Parthians had a whole lot. They probably controlled a little bit of Western Afghanistan region, but not so much. The Shakas, the Kushan kingdom, which started from modern day Bactria, the White Huns, then the Turkish migrated, and then later the Mongols, the Tamerlanes. So these are the various dynasties and the ethnic population that control and where they arise from. So this is taken from the book that I showed you about earlier before everybody logged in, was the recent book called The Wars of Afghanistan, so which is a big tome that for the real true history buffs, as you can see there, I'm making my way through it, but it's more for the modern era type of thing. And it's written by the ambassador to Afghanistan during the first Bush era. Okay, I think I'll do, I think let's just go through a couple of the things and then we'll take a break, if I may. Okay, and this is the March of Alexander. As you can see, it started out from, and obviously after defeating the Persian Empire, went all the way to the Indus River and returned back via sea route. And so, and I have some nice videos for that, this is, so you can see how it goes all the way to, managed to conquer the modern day Afghanistan. And even he had a tough time due to the so-called guerrilla warfare, because the Persians fought in the regular manner as to organize army and facing, and that's where he was able to defeat, his legions were able to defeat the Persian army. But during the modern day Afghanistan era, because of the terrain with the so-called attack and disappear type of regime, so he did not have as easy a time as he had with the Persians, so to speak. And so he followed Darius, as it's well known, from set fire to the famous ruins of Phrenius, capital of Persepolis, and Darius was killed by his own men. And then he appointed his the satrap of Bactria. He was and Darius was replaced by a guy named Basis, and there was a kingdom of Sogdia at that time. And then he came down, and he had enough of a megalomania to name various cities of himself, so he created various Alexandrias in the region, which I'll have a slide later on. And the city that was considered one that he named in the modern day Afghanistan area was Area, which is the modern day Herat. Then he suppressed South. He adopted various native customs, suppressed various conspiracies, went all the way to Rivas Oxus in the Pamirs, which is the modern day Amudarya, in one of the stans. Okay, I'm not going to try to keep them separate, because they could be a bit too confusing. I remember it for a few minutes, but then afterwards it kind of, get them mixed up. So Sogdia is the modern day Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. And then he came down to modern day Samarkand. Okay, and at that time he encouraged his troops to marry the local women. That may explain a lot of the genetic mixture that took place. And there was a lot of bad weather. They not only were faced with bad weather and ice and snow, as well as the desert. Okay, and he went all the way to 326 before current era to the river, which the Greeks call is Hydapsis, Hydapses. In modern day India, Pakistan, it's called Jhelum, Jhelum, which is the famous river that runs through Pakistan, through Kashmir and Pakistan. So we're coming up to 11 o'clock, so we should take about a 5-minute break. I think we can pause the recording if you don't mind, before we get started. Okay, type of thing, especially if anybody has read or anything that you're curious about. Okay, and I'll send out the slides as I said earlier. So and so I'm hoping that we can get through at least, another 30 or 40 slides, because some of them are just pictures, which are just curiosity type of thing. So instead of putting too many on this thing. Okay, so this is the March of Alexander. So the map again, illustrates as to, and the map on the green map on the right shows the various cities founded by Alexander. So he obviously, loved to name things after himself, the Alexandria up in north in Sogdia, and Hindu Kush type thing. And the one that might have been left over is Kandahar, which the word may have been made more native type of thing. So, and he went past, and there is no city on the Arabian Sea, I think, in the Pakistan border. So I think it's interestingly just to show that the Chinese are building a seaport around here in the present-day Balochistan, because just like the Russians, the Chinese want to make sure that they control the Persian Gulf, the flow of oil. So that is the Silk Road. So that's why the Chinese are building a big seaport, which has been given by the Pakistanis to the Chinese. So so there's a few things. There's a port that is being built with the Chinese money. And the same way on the southern coast of India and Sri Lanka, they're building a port in present-day Sri Lanka or former Ceylon. So they are trying to do the same thing that the Russians did to control the access to the sea route. Okay, and this was their famous. Obviously, you know all of this very well. The story that he married the princess from present-day Bactria, named Roxanne. Okay, and which is the river, which is the present-day Amu-Darya, and he went into the to the border of India and fought the Indian king named Porus, who controlled the modern-day Punjab and Kashmir at that fight, and obviously he was able to outsmart the Indian king, right? Because the Indian side had the elephants, and Alexander was able to cross upstream the river, Jhelum River, up north and get behind Porus, and his elephants were frightened, and so that's how he was able to defeat King Porus. And now, obviously, he had and that time the Greek concept was they were reaching the end of the world, so he had personal ambitions to go across and go to the edge of the world, as what their belief was. But his soldiers finally put their foot down and managed to force him to turn him back. Okay, and then I'll have a few more words to say about the taxila, which was the Greek word for it, and the Sanskritized word is called takshashila. And Roxanne she was a colorful character, that when finally she returned with Alexander to modern day Persia, and he had also married one of the Persian princesses, and she managed to kill the second wife, and wanting her son to be the Alexander the Fourth, and obviously, and then she was killed by some other people. So it was just one of this thing about the inheritance that just went on. So after his sudden death, whether he was poisoned or he died natural death from a fever, it remains to be, it's not well clarified. Now there are varieties of regions of Swat district. So these are the areas of Pakistan, and you can see how the words are carried on. Suvastu is a Sanskrit word. It's called fair dwellings. So it goes back all the way to 327 BC current era, then followed by this is a district. So the varieties of areas of Afghanistan are controlled by various kingdoms, not just Alexander, but later on the Indian kingdoms and the Parthians in Kushan and the Huns. And last but not the least, the Hindu Shahi kingdoms and that was the end of the Indian or Hindus control over the modern day Afghanistan region in the 800 current era, finally the rise of the Islam. And this is the area, why that is important, because that is where Malala, the Nobel laureate, grew up in the Swat district, and so explains the area as to what is now in Pakistan, because the way the borders have been defined later on. And these are some of the, it was interesting, I got carried away about seeing the historic area of the Swat region, and there are the various Buddhist stupas are still relics that are still exist in that area. And these are some of the, again, more stupas that were dating back to 3rd century current era. And these are on display in the Swat Museum in modern day Pakistan. But at that time, it was part of Afghanistan region, and this was the last Hindu fort at around 800 CC, the Hindu Shahi kings, which were defeated by the Islamic march that managed to conquer Afghanistan. And these are some of the modern day relics when the Taliban managed to destroy. So these are some of these excavations were done earlier by the French in 1930s in that region. Some of the relics were taken to France, and then this is really a sort of gut-wrenching testing as to how the Taliban actually systematically destroyed when entered the museum wards in Afghanistan and began smashing anything that was of human and animal form because they considered it to be blasphemous. And the Afghan curators managed to hide some of his inside the Ministry of Information storage spaces in the bank wards at the risk to their lives and in central Kabul to protect it from the quote unquote the Mujahideen attacks. So that's and later on, after the defeat of Taliban, they were meticulously trying to put things back together with the assistance of the local curators and the archaeology experts, as well as some assistance given by University of Chicago Oriental Institute. So it's a very how the relics were destroyed by the fanaticism of Taliban. Okay, and I think hopefully this will play. I think if I'm keeping my fingers crossed that you can listen to the audio.
The sound of mallet and chisel fills the rustic landscape of Texela, a small town some 50 kilometers from Islamabad. Sitting by the roadside under the shade of mulberry trees, men work on stones for hours on end. Texela may look like an ordinary town, but it's a place of historical significance. It was once the spiritual and cultural hub of one of the world's oldest faiths, Buddhism, and was home to the Gandhara School of Sculpture, a treasure trove of arts and crafts. Gandhara art appeared in the region in the 1st century BC and flourished till the 8th century AD. Even after the civilization faded, Gandhara art was kept alive, handed down from one generation to another.
Although Texela's population today is predominantly Muslim, its Buddhist past has had a significant impact on people's lives that's evident in local handicrafts and the flourishing stone carving industry.
With Buddhist influences, Texela sculptors produce replicas of historical stonework. One of them is 37-year-old Muhammad Sadakat, a resident of Texela and expert stone sculptor for the past 15 years.
बुजुर्गों का कहना है ना कि किसी ज़माना में किस वक्त में ये अपना जो है ना टेक्सला किसी ज़माना में मतलब संतराशों का शहर होता था। संतराशों का शहर मतलब इसमें मुख्तलिफ़ चीज़ें मतलब है कि हर चीज़ का अपना अपना रंग कलर डिज़ाइन जैसे तुम के टेबल होगा अच्छा वैन ग्लास होंगे तो जो कपड़े वगैरह होंगी तो लंगरियाँ वगैरह होंगी तो फिर जो है ना जी और बहुत कुछ मतलब है कि स्टैंड जो बत्ती जलाने वाले नहीं होते स्टैंड भी होते पत्थर से सब जो है ना चीज़ें नमूने मतलब है कि इन पत्थर से कमालात उनके बनते हैं.
His day begins at 6 in the morning and for the next 12 hours he remains at his spot under the tree. He can finish 7 to 8 pieces a day, earning about $5 for a day's work. Sadakat lost his father at a young age, and as the eldest of 5 children, he has to take care of his family.
मेरे मामू हजरात जो है ना उनके साथ मैं पहाड़ पे गया हूँ उधर फिर मैंने ट्रेनिंग वगैरह ली है, ट्रेनिंग वगैरह मेरी हाल क्लियर हुई है, तो मतलब फिर जो है ना, तो उनका काम अलहदा हो गया, तो हमारा काम अलहदा हो गया। तो वो बोलते हैं, मामू बोलते हैं, मतलब अब्दुल रहीम उनका नाम है ना, तो बोलते हैं कि तुम अपना खुद काम करो, मैं अपना खुद काम करूँगा।
The mountains Sadakat talks about are not far from where he sits. They are home to over 20 ancient sites, including Mesolithic era caves and archaeological remains of 4 early settlements. In ancient times, Texela hosted a number of Buddhist monasteries. Its civilization reached its peak between the 1st and 5th centuries. Today, it is one of the most important archaeological sites in Asia and was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1980.
ये जगह जो थी, इसका जो पीरियड था, ये 1st सेंचुरी एडी से 5 सेंचुरी एडी तक था। 455 ईस्वी में सेंट्रल एशिया से एक हमला और कौम आई थी, वाइट हंस, उनके हाथों ये सारी तहजीब और ये यूनिवर्सिटी तबाह हो गई थी। बाद में ये जगह माशी बदहाली की वजह से ज़माने के रहम करम पर पड़ी रही। आंधी, तूफ़ान, ज़लज़ले, जखड़ इसके दबने के असबाब बने थे।
Ramzan Abbasi has been a caretaker of archaeological sites in Texela for over 3 decades and has become somewhat of an authority on Buddhist history, culture, and way of life. He looks after Jolia, a site of a Buddhist monastery that some consider the world's oldest university. Ramzan says remains of 4 settlements in Texela reveal a pattern of urban evolution in the Indian subcontinent through more than 5 centuries.
क्योंकि ये टेक्सला 3 दफ़ा तबाह हुआ था, इसके 2 पीरियड इससे पहले ज़लज़लों से तबाह हुए थे। टेक्सला का जो
Oh, I'm sorry. Something happened here.
पहला पीरियड था वो 6ठी सदी बिफोर क्राइस्ट से 2nd सेंचुरी बिफोर क्राइस्ट तक था, और 2nd सेंचुरी बिफोर क्राइस्ट में बहुत बड़ा ज़लज़ला आया था जिससे पूरा शहर तबाह हो गया था। फिर आज सरे नो टेक्सला को आबाद किया गया था, जो दूसरी सदी बिफोर क्राइस्ट से लास्ट सेंचुरी बिफोर क्राइस्ट तक था, और वो शहर भी ज़लज़लों से तबाह हुआ था। ये तीसरा जो पीरियड था ना, इसमें इस तरह की कंस्ट्रक्शन हुई थी। आप देखें हर दीवार के सेंटर में बड़े पत्थर यूज़ हुए हैं, साइड में छोटे पत्थर। ये जब ज़लज़ले आते हैं ना, तो छोटे पत्थर शॉक अब्जर्वर का काम करते हैं, दीवार गिरने से रुक जाती है। और ये दरमियान में पानी का तालाब था। उस ज़माने में जितनी भी बिल्डिंगें बनाई जाती थी, उनके दरमियान में ब्यूटी के लिए या बिल्डिंग को ठंडा रखना मकसूद होता था, या सूरज चांद की लाइट को रिफ्लेक्शन करने के लिए तालाब बनाए जाते।
Born in the year 563 BC in Lumbini, present-day Nepal, Buddha never came to this part of the world, but many of his followers settled in Texela.
इबादत गाह का एरिया था, और ये 2 पार्ट्स पर मुश्तमिल था। बुद्धा की डेथ के 200 बरस बाद 272 बिफोर क्राइस्ट में ये अशोक इस मज़हब का पहला एम्पीरियर बना था, तो उसने वो राख वहाँ से निकाल कर अपनी सुल्तनत के मुख्तलिफ हिस्सों में, जहाँ बुद्ध तहजीब के बड़े मरकज़ शहर थे, जिनमें ये टेक्सला सर फहरिस्त था, ये अंदर जो मेन स्तूपा, इस तरह के मेन स्तूपा बनाए गए थे, जिनके अंदर बुद्धा की थोड़ी थोड़ी राख है, जो तबर्रुक बमा डोनेशन के दफन हुई थी। और बाद में जो बुद्ध के फॉलोअर लोग थे, उनके लिए ये मेन मरकज़ बन गए थे।
In 327 BC, Alexander the Great conquered Texela, and later it came under the Mauryan dynasty and reached a great level of development.
During the 2nd century, Buddhism was adopted as the state religion in this part of the world. It flourished and prevailed here for over 1,000 years until the 10th century. At the time, Texela became an important center for culture, trade, and learning.
The next period in Texela's history was that of the Indo-Greek descendants of Alexander's warriors. And then came the Gandhara period, The Great Koshan dynasty was established in 50 AD, and for 200 years Taxila became a renowned center for philosophy and art before it was vandalized beyond repair. Those who visit the remains are struck with awe.
पढ़ा है लेकिन इतना डिटेल के साथ नहीं पढ़ा हमने उस तरह जब आके देखा तो ज़्यादा अच्छा लगा ज़्यादा समझ में आई इन्फॉर्मेशन टाइप मिली डिटेल में बताई है बाकी मैंने ज़्यादा पहले देखा है कि ये जगह कैसी है डिटेल से पहले मैंने देखे कि ये है कैसे कैसे फीचर्स टाइप पहले इन चीज़ों पे मैं ज़्यादा फोकस मैंने किया है डिटेल अभी हम और लेंगे नहीं निकालना चाहिए सर्च करना चाहिए इतनी इन्फॉर्मेशन मतलब इस चीज़ से इतनी इन्फॉर्मेशन मिलती है इतनी नॉलेज मिलती है आई डोंट थिंक सो मशीन्स होंगी क्योंकि वो तो बहुत पुराना ज़माना था बहुत कदीम ज़माना था मशीनें तो अब ज़्यादा अब आई हैं ना पहले ज़माने में तो मुझे लगता है इनकी इंसानों की अपनी एफर्ट्स थी और ख़ास तौर पर उस ज़माने के इंसान थे भी बड़े ताकतवर मतलब आजकल देखें आजकल के इंसानों को देखें और उस ज़माने के इंसानों को देखें तो काफ़ी फ़र्क होता है उनमें
This is Sirkap, a fortified city founded in the mid-2nd century BC. The many private houses.
Okay, I think that's about the end of it. I think there's just only one couple of 2 minutes type of thing because otherwise I didn't realize it was such a long.
Bharat,
thing.
look on the chat, Lori Woodard has a question. With the return of the Taliban, are there indications that this destruction will recur?
This is controlled by the more regular area of Pakistan, so probably not because it's not in the contested region, because like the Pakistani, this is in a different location, so it's more on the Indian side type of thing. So it's not totally, Taliban is much more prominent in, and they're putting their finally they are realizing that in Pakistan alone, the Taliban have been killing a lot more Pakistanis. So the Pakistani army is finally putting their foot down, so they are, and they're a lot more powerful than, you realize because, I'll talk, because it's like a Pakistani can be classified as a army with a state. Okay. So the army controls a lot of this thing. And that's why during the thing, so they can keep them in check very easily. So probably not. Okay. Hopefully it's that's at least that's one hopes. Obviously, it can always go totally upside down, but it's highly unlikely that they'll let it happen. They have they're a pretty modern army. So that huge amount of budget is controlled by the army. So it's a different story altogether. So highly unlikely. Okay, so I think we shall move on. So I think it was an interesting, but it summarizes a lot of the slides that were, so I can go through them more quickly because it summarizes things nicely type of thing. Okay, so, and then this is, I think for sake of time, I'm just going to go over this. This is a similar thing that some of you, and especially the Brits may be familiar with English BBC historian named Michael Wood. He's about 73 and he's they've done some erudite series on history of Britain as well as very popular announcers. And said one of the series that he did was, and he also did back in the 80s, called the whole 6-part series on BBC called Story of India, which was I showed part of it in one of my classes, And one of the stories he did was in Alexander's footsteps. So. And obviously with the BBC resources, they traveled all the way from west to east. And it was some interesting stories type of thing. So I'll send out the link type of thing, because otherwise it's too many videos can be a bit distracting. And it shows about how hard it was, and some of the destruction that took place by the Taliban in the museum. So it's almost a gut-wrenching things, but I'll just send out the link so you can watch it if you're interested. Okay. And these are some of the Greek relics, and that he left his generals or satraps afterwards. And then they were confronted with the powerful Mauryan Empire of India, which is a so-called golden age of Indian Empire, which is the first time India was controlled from north to south by one dynasty that started from the foothills of Himalayas. And he may be less well known in the West, was his grandson, Ashoka that they referred to was the big history that took place, was that he fought a big battle, and after winning the war, he was totally heartbroken as to see how many people have been killed, and then he gave up violence and adopted Buddhism, and sent his own children to spread Buddhism out in China and Sri Lanka. And he has erected various stupas and relics and columns all over India. And some of them were put together by the British archaeologists who were polymaths to say, and they actually put the timing as to when this occurred, because in the Greek literature, the name that was used was called Sandrocotus, Sandrocottus. So then they put and then the British archaeologists, being familiar with the Sanskrit and the Hindi script, had said that this was the same Indian king or emperor called Chandragupta, and that was the name was written in the Greek literature as Sandrocotus, and that's why they were able to put the timing together, because the Indians were notorious; they didn't write down anything, so it was very hard to put the linguistic links together. So that's how the whole links were. So it was almost like an archaeological detective story. Okay, and the Mauryan Empire that extended, as you can see, that extended from present-day Afghanistan and Gandhara all the way to South India, and this started somewhere. The capital was somewhere in the middle of, in the foothills of Himalayas in this region, and it was a classical. And during the axial age, his grandson was Buddhist King Ashoka, and King Ashoka is still considered a cultural this thing. And some of the columns that were built by him, they're still, and some of them are steel columns. And and during the Muslim era, they were transported literally to Delhi from northwest India, and some of the steel was so good that it still hasn't shown any sign of rusting. And one of the columns is that when India became independent, some of the columns were still used as a symbol of the four lions, as you can see that this is the Ashoka pillar that is still in Delhi. There are the four lions that is considered one of the emblems of in the Indian flag, of the four lions and the column that is still part of the King Ashoka's thing. So this is an historical ties that is continued. And this was Ashoka, and the pillar have been discovered even in Kandahar. So it shows how the cultural empire and the religious thing continued. And this was discovered, during excavation done by a German archaeologist, Orientalist rather, the correct word, a guy named Aurel Stein, Aurel Stein. It was in 1963 that was discovered in Afghanistan, modern day Afghanistan. So Greek, and that's the Wikipedia link of the discovery during, when Afghanistan was at peace. And these are some of the excavations from that pillar. So it's a fascinating archaeological history and this is the column that is in modern day Kandahar. So we can trace back from Alexander to Buddhist to modern day Afghanistan and this were the maps of so we'll go over some of these things rather quickly because the history earlier. By the way, the language that was spoken in the Taxila video was called Urdu, U-R-D-U, which is the lingua franca of Pakistan, as you can see that. And that is a mixture of Hindi and Persian. And so that became the national language of Pakistan. And it is interspersed with the British influence. You can see how even the guy who was obviously not educated, stonecutter, and he was using the word training as to how the English word. So the British influence had still infiltrated. Obviously, the curator of the museum, who was, his language was how the linguistic mixture of the predominance of English that has taken place all over the former British Empire. One can see that was just really still sort of this thing as to how some words are not easily translatable, so to speak. So this was, the British Empire starting from the Indo-Greek influence, and this is the Bactrian kingdom that that region was called the modern day Stans, that is called Sogdian region. And so after Alexander left, so this were the leftover influence that was there. And again, in some of the scripts that were discovered in the area of, in the border of Hindu Kush in Pakistan, that was discovered as early as 1931. Okay, and the Buddhist sutras that were, some of them written in Sanskrit, and some of them obviously, just like the Rosetta Stone, have ended up in London. Some are still in Pakistan, some are still in Kashmir. Okay, so these are some of the relics that were, and so this and so various archaeological relics have been found in various caves, in Central Asia. So this shows the ties of Buddhism and the white, and this was before the Sea Route. And obviously, the majority of trade that went on was from silk trade, from Central Asia. And so Afghanistan was the kind of crossroads between the West and the East. And so from Central Asia, and then later on came the Kushan Kingdom, and these are some of the coins that were discovered. And this is the Kushan Kingdom. You can see how that extended far and wide, from Bactria all the way to Northwest India. So, okay, so this was, so kingdoms have come and gone from times immemorial. And you can see some of the scripts that are done in Greek language, so you can see the coins that are printed. So the linguistic overlap that took place. And a lot of these were destroyed by the white Huns later on. Okay. And again, obviously, with the rise of Islam, some of them have fallen the wayside. Okay. And then obviously the rise of various, and we already talked to some of these, so I shall just gloss over some of these things. Okay, I think. And by this time, some of the earliest documentation was done by the Chinese monk who traveled. There were two, I think I'm going to murder them, at Fahian, that's the name that was pronounced. The Chinese words are difficult to pronounce. It can be spelled Faxian as well as Fahion. The correct pronunciation is, I'm not going to try to venture that, but and then the other monk that who came about, more or less, and a few hundred years after, called Huan Sing, and he came in via the land route, as you can see from in the picture here, starting from northern China on the Silk Road to Takshashila, okay, and then to various Buddhist sites, where the Buddha is supposed to have died, near Kapilvastu, and which Patliputra was the kingdom of the Mauryan Empire, and some of the relics have been found. And this is where he finally, I think he died near Sarnath. So these are the various Buddhist pilgrimage sites, that are still visited by a lot of the Japanese, when they travel to India for a religious pilgrimage, so to speak. So this was, and then he went back by sea route, traveling to Sri Lanka, and took various manuscripts into China. And so these are some of the most formal records that are available. Okay. Now for something completely fun, actually this is, some of you may have seen this movie in 1975, it was a movie that was made by none other than James Bond, Sean Connery, and Michael Caine, and this was, they were the two deserters from the British Army, and who wanted to be a king. And this is based on a story that I sent out. I think some of you may have had time to see The Man Who Would Be King. That was a little small story by Rudyard Kipling. Okay, and so that was made into a movie by John Huston, and it's a fun movie to see, type of thing. So okay, and I think I have a clip for that later on. And this is interesting that there actually were people who were all over. And this is this colorful character who looks like wearing a Sikh turban or Muslim turban, was a colorful character named Alexander Gardner. Okay, and Alexander Gardner was a Scotsman who was born in Wisconsin, and then he went to Europe, came back to America. Then he decided to seek his fortune with his brothers in Europe, and then traveled, wanted to find an employment in Russia, didn't have much luck, so wandered through Central Asia. Around in 1700 or so, was captured by the Afghan emirs, and ended up serving initially with the Afghans and later on with the Sikh army. So he was almost like a tank commander and a trainer. So rose to the rank of colonel, okay, married a local woman, and then finally, after the Brits conquered, they defeated the Sikh army and became part of the British Empire, he went back to England and had written a book. So the exploits of Alexander Gardner, not to be confused with another Alexander Gardner, who was a photographer during the Civil War in the United States. So there are two Alexander Gardners. So it's an interesting, colorful character as to how people went around even in those days, type thing. So here is an American-born Scotsman who ends up as a colonel in the Sikh army in the British India. Okay, so that's a very interesting story type of thing. Okay, now this is, I think, okay, so I think it's a fun movie to see. Okay, just I don't know if anybody spot who plays Kipling. Can you spot the actor? Okay,
Wasn't it
that's
Christopher Plummer? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Oh,
Yeah,
I
the
saw
Man
it
of
on
Steel.
the credits. I didn't. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Very astute. Yeah. So that was Christopher Plummer. So it's just. I think this turned out to be a much better movie than it would have been, because the trivia that I found was John Huston was originally thinking about making it with Humphrey Bogart. I just can't see Humphrey Bogart pulling off an English accent. Sorry, as much as he's good in African Queen, but not here. Okay, but that's my prejudice. So that's like, Okay, so enough of that. So it was a. Okay, now there actually is a real Kafristan. There is an actually small province called Nuristan it's a province up there, so I'm sorry for my misspelled, I think I'm a lousy typist, it's a small area of Afghanistan, which was actually, then these are, this is actually, you'll get a kick out of this, I think I have to play this, these are the original people that the Germans were fascinated, because obviously, they were big into the Aryan, blonde, blue-eyed people type of thing, so they were fascinated with the true type of Aryans who were found in Afghanistan. So, they had this thing about saying, okay, they are the lost people, that they're similar to us, so to speak. So. Okay, it's a fairly long video, but I'll be happy to send it out for those, because because sometimes the music can be a little jarring to Western ears. So this was, you can see from the features that you can see why the Germans were fascinated by their appearance, because obviously this was before. Now it's interesting that now there were a lot of ideas originally, obviously, that they were descendants of Greeks and other stuff, but that's not really this thing, because this was the original migration that took place from Central Asia. And based on genetics, that if a population is isolated, the gene does not get weeded out, so to speak. So that's, so that may be one of the genetic explanations for it, type of thing. And then obviously those of you who are more astute readers of National Geographic, may have remember from a few years ago, a story about the Kalash people. And so these were people who practiced a sort of ancient type of Hinduism, okay? And they were finally, almost like in the 18th or 19th century, by the Afghan Amir, they were forcefully converted to Islam, okay? And still some of the traditions and the dances still reflect Hinduism. And there were two types, these were encountered by Alexander later on around in 1000 current era by Afghan ruler named Muhammad Ghazni, and as well as by Timur Lane. And they, because of the terrain that was there, they had a tough time trying to get it under control. Okay, so finally they just decided to throw up their hand and left them to their own devices, so to speak. And they were finally with the modern access available around 1719 by one of the Afghan emirs, they were converted to Islam. And there were considered two types of kafirs. One is called Siyah and Safed, S-I-A-H, Siyah, okay? And that means black clad. Now, obviously, that, for me, it's knowing some elementary Sanskrit and Hindi, it's very easy to understand because Siyah, it dates back to Shyam, that means black in Sanskrit. And Safed means white in Hindi. So you can just see how the linguistic links continue. So to me, that was kind of fascinating things to learn about, how the things have continued. And the modern day genetics have broken some of the myths, because even the locals in Kalash, they still claim, says, okay, well, we are the descendants of Alexander. But based on some of the genetic drift and isolation of gene pool, that has been disproven. And obviously this was, so some of the ideas were pouted was, okay, well, the idea that was pouted was, or they were the lost tribes of Israel. Again, there are no similarities between the Ashkenazi Jews and some of the groups that haven't withstood the modern day genetic analysis. And obviously, these are some of the Bamyan Buddhas that you are all familiar with from the history, okay? And they have to, like Huns did a lot to destroy them, okay? And and obviously, this was by the time the chariot was the big a mode of transport by the people who migrated from the Yamanya culture. They migrated not just to Europe, but also to the Indo-Iranian plains. And that was the big way that they were able to get around quickly. Okay, and some of the god names that were continued, are still continued in the Norse culture, as well as in the Iranian cultures, as well as in the Indian classical. For example, the word Indra, okay, that continues. And just to show the trivia, the Beatles played at the Indra Club in Hamburg, okay? And the Indra gods, some of the Norse gods, that are similar to the Zoroastrian or the pre-Zoroastrian culture of modern day Persia, as well as the Vedic culture of India. So that just shows the common links historically. And some of the cultures that have been discovered, by the chariots, two-wheeled golden chariots, and they've been excavated even with the modern day archaeological excavation in the Yamanya culture. And obviously, I alluded to earlier about the Hindu Shahi culture, and that kind of came to an end with the attack by the Islamic conquest of Northwest India as well as Afghanistan. And obviously, this is well known. This figure just may jog back memories. The Bamiyan Valley, which is northwest of Kabul, and that was destroyed by the Taliban at that. And the Buddhist monk, several thousand of them lived in the valley in around 600 current era. Okay. And this is the rise of the Islam. And the Islam entered the peninsula of, I'm sorry, let me see if I can, this is made of the Sindh as early as 700 current era type thing. And then again, obviously, it took them on a couple of hundred years to conquer, what is modern day Afghanistan. And by that time, the Persian Empire had run out of steam, so to speak, and the Zoroastrianism was totally vanquished in modern day Persia or Iran, as we call it. And that was one of the big migration of a small community of Zoroastrians that came to the coast of India around here, pretty well near where I was born in this area of India. This is Bombay City, and they came to a small seaport. There was no Bombay in those days, in 1200 current era. And then they were given, they were welcomed, and they went on to become successful Zoroastrian or Parsi community, okay, which I alluded to earlier. I think so. Okay, so this is, the first conquest. By this time, Islam spread like wildfire, not just east, and but also to the west, and they managed to conquer the whole of North Africa, and pretty soon, they were on the doorsteps of Europe. Okay, the only difference between the Europeans were able to stop the Islamic conquest, in somewhere near Spain, and also later on in Vienna. Okay, while the Indian subcontinent was not so lucky, and came under Muslim rule starting from around 1192 current era to the end of Mughal Empire that was put to rest by the Brits after the mutiny in 1857, when the last Mughal emperor was sent into exile after the mutiny by East India Company. So the Muslim rule lasted for, let me rephrase again, 1192, that was the Muslim, until 1857 in the subcontinent. And obviously, the part of Afghanistan was under the Islamic rule, starting from Delhi onwards. They conquered all the way up to Kabul. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit more about it as to how they came about. Okay, the rise of Islam, and this is, you can recognize the symbol, the spread of Islam. This started from the Arabian Peninsula. Okay, and went into different directions, Yeah, this is not a video, but I mean, you had the general idea type of thing. That was a very, a rapid spread, into North Africa and along the coast. And pretty soon, they were on the coast of Spain and the famous Alhambra Palace. And at the same time, all the way to Xinjiang up here, and all to into the Indian subcontinent. And they were, by the time as early as 700 current era, there were Arab traders in South Asia. And by that time, they were also in the Bengal, and they were, because of the Hindu religions had the myth of not crossing the sea. So that was considered, a taboo, so to speak. So the Arabs were the middlemen in the spice trade all along, okay, that went on from the Roman era. So they were the middlemen, so to speak, so and then obviously they migrated and they managed to conquer Indonesia. So the Islam spread was, was nothing to be sneezed at. And they were able to, during the golden era of Islamic caliphates, that started from the 7th century until the peak of 1500 or so, that they managed to conquer a large portion of the world. Okay. Now, this is an interesting side piece that some of you may be aware of it, but this is the Roma, or the Gypsies, or Dome, as they were called. They started out from India, from Northwest India. So, and it was still, after several investigations, it has been proven that they started out from, somewhere in the plains of Rajasthan, or the desert area of India. Okay, and then they migrated out. As you can see, that they managed to get out rapidly over a span of a few hundred years, and appeared in Europe, in the Byzantine Empire, in the 11th century, and then by the 16th century, they were already in Europe. Okay, so that was the rise of the Europe. I think so. And again, this was originally it was considered, was controversial as to where they originated from. But some of the and it is now it's believed that they were probably trying to run away from the Muslim conquest, and some of the Hindu armies that were there, they tried to fight, and the leaders had died, and they managed to migrate westward and westward to run away from the Islamic area. So they managed to survive for whatever reasons, a relatively small climb, and then they gradually multiplied and ended up in Europe. Okay, and why that is proven is because some of the Hindi martial terms are still prevalent in the Roma language. Okay, and the various Romani scholars believe that this was the population where Rajput or the north central Indian warriors. They were part of the. They were warriors, and with the Ghazni Empire around 1000 current era, they would have traveled with their families and the so-called camp followers, entertainers, blacksmiths. And that's why one of the reasons, as you can see, even in Europe, they make their living by entertaining and by blacksmithing and fortune tellers. Okay, so this was, so this was one of the stuff that is based on the current research. So that's an interesting trivia that, and this was again some of the spread of Islam that has taken place, that I already showed the slides earlier. Okay, all right, and these are some of the empires that the regional empire that started from Ghazni, which is the city in modern Afghanistan. And obviously, originally, the one of the big incentives, this may be argued or upset some people, but some of the stuff was that they were promised the loot, because the army, invading army, they were given a share of the loot type of thing. So there were several raids that were carried out in India, because Indian economy was almost second in the world at that time after China. So the various raids were carried out at various temples by the Islamic armies, and then subsequently followed by another kingdom called Gauri Kingdom. Okay, and some of them just raided, looted, and came and went back, and some of them gradually established kingdom. Some of so that, for example, the Gauri, there is still the Pakistanis claim to be their descendants, and the modern day Pakistani missiles are still named Gauri missiles. Okay, so this is the same way the North Koreans have missiles, the Pakistani missiles are named Gauri. Obviously, they did not have any direct connections because that was part of Afghanistan, but because of the religious influence, they came to be tied into. So if I may borrow 5-10 minutes, I want to get to about 5 or 6 more slides so I can reach to my mental point type of thing. So these were the various kingdoms that defeated the Rajput and the Hindu kingdoms that were, again, because they were never quite united, and somehow the battle did not turn out to be. And the various temple raids that were carried out, there's a famous temple on the coast of India, I think, so which we'll talk about, that was raided about 17 times by the Ghaznis, and that was looted and destroyed. Okay, and there's some fairly interesting stories that, and so much so that the temple was destroyed, and the doors of the temples were taken back to Ghazni and made part of one of the mosques or tombs type of thing. And during the first Afghan war, to placate and to justify the invasion, the British army decided to bring the doors back and try to convince the Hindu population as well they were defending their faith. So they're still in some museum in Agra, which is where the Taj Mahal is. So these are some of the doors that were preserved and were brought by the Brits to show that, that they were jolly good fellows. They were bringing back the Hindu treasure that was looted by the Islamic invasion. Okay, so there are, and so these stones were placed in, so and so let me see. Okay, one more forward. And this is the famous temple that had been rebuilt in Gujarat, which is the bordering the Arabian Sea. And this was the temple that had was rebuilt several times by the Hindu kings and was looted by the Islamic invasions. And this has been well documented by the famous Arabian historian al-Biruni, who lived, in the 11th century, an Iranian polymath, who was Shiites, but had managed to find a job, was hired by the Sunni kings, Ghazni kings, and he was not only a scientist, a linguist, Indologist, and wrote several, he had claimed to have written as many as 146 books, and they were devoted to astronomy, mathematics, mathematical geography. And so he lived in the golden age of Islam, and he had written varieties of very scholarly record of comparative religion of not just Islam, but Buddhism, Hinduism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism. So it was a very erudite, and this shows one of his examples of, and they were ahead of deciding as to whether the phases of the moon, so some of these astronomical texts that one can find. Okay, so I think we'll just stop right here because we're coming up to 12:05, and I think we're reasonably on time, so we'll go ahead with the Mongol conquest with the great Genghis Khan. So you can see how quickly the empire spread of the Mongol hordes, which started out from Central Asia, and the map is playing. This is a GIF image, so how quickly. And they were not the nicest people, type of around, they had mountains of skulls. So wherever they went, they literally destroyed, Baghdad and all the big cities that they encountered, and obviously the Europeans were awfully frightened, with the Mongol hordes, so that's, I'm sure you're all familiar with the Genghis Khan, and this is a supposedly picture of the Genghis Khan, and they were, to their credit was their small horses, extremely mobile army, and a true meritocracy in the army. So that's one of the reasons perhaps their success. And they were able to live on relatively small needs. And obviously, the map almost is frightening. And this is interesting that I have side interest in genetics, that almost like 20 or 40% of population have the Genghis Khan genes, how they proved that. That's like, obviously he was a very prolific man in more ways than one, to put it mildly. So I think it's 12:05. We shall stop here. I can, if you don't mind, John, stop recording, and I will try to address the